Today, I'm going to drag your family tree so far back it stops being family and starts being single cells. And then I'll show you which modern animals and even which plants can be called our real relatives. We like thinking the world is basically solved. Big Bang, expanding universe, primordial soup, humans popped out, physics runs the show. Neat story, comfortable story. And let's be honest, it quietly lets us feel like we're the main character compared to every other living thing. The only problem is that science hasn't actually nailed the foundation as cleanly as we pretend. In 2023, James Webb spotted massive, already formed galaxies only about 300 million years after the starting point. By the rules we currently use, those galaxies shouldn't be there yet. So the headline model suddenly looks a lot less unshakable. And the life from soup model isn't exactly sitting pretty either. The ribose idea, that this key sugar appears naturally and helps build RNA, one of life's essential structures, is about 160 years old and basically became biology's default explanation. Then, in 2025, researchers at a Georgia institute ran a ridiculous number of simulations of that primordial mix, and ribose didn't show up even once. So now, both pillars wobble. Which is why modern science sometimes feels like the bell curve meme. Low IQ says no clue what's going on. Average IQ says everything makes sense. High IQ circles back to no clue what's going on. And that brings us to the fun question. If the beginning of the universe is being argued about, then what about the beginning of us? What other explanations do scientists seriously discuss, and which ones are actually reasonable? In the next couple minutes, we'll unpack the bolder but still defensible ideas. You'll find out mushrooms are closer to humans than to plants, that brainless plants share more with us than insects do, and that memory storage can be described quite literally as a kind of illness. You can drop a like right now because, yes, the first theory we're touching opens with humans descend from aquatic apes. It sounds like bait because the standard evolutionary narrative puts our ancestors in forests. Then forests shrink, competition gets brutal, and the losers are pushed into open savanna. No trees means no climbing, so you start moving on two legs. From there, upright posture, culture, anime, whatever you want to blame on it. But even if you don't buy the aquatic ape idea at all, the savanna story has awkward gaps. Take hair loss. For a land primate, losing fur is a weird decision. Chimps and most monkeys keep their coats even in hot regions. And honestly, even today, a full layer of hair would still be useful for humans, but we ditched it. Instead, we ended up with something that screams ocean biology. Thick subcutaneous fat, the personal enemy of every athlete, and a trait that's far more typical for marine mammals. That's the doorway into the aquatic hypothesis. Back in 1960, marine biologist Alistair Hardy suggested we don't just resemble chimpanzees on our evolutionary route. In some key features, we line up strangely well with seals and whales. Reduced body hair for better movement through water, and a fat layer built for temperature control.
Hardy had another little observation that supporters love. Our noses point downward, which can be read as a built-in splash guard. Add to that the fact that sweating helps dump salt, and that humans, weirdly compared to other primates, have a strong diving reflex and can stay without air much longer. And yes, the classic cherry on top, the barely there webbing between our fingers. From there, the story practically writes itself. A hypothetical ancestor gets introduced, Neopithecus, and the plot goes like this. When forests shrank, this ancestor didn't march into the savanna like the standard narrative says. Instead, it hugged rivers and coasts, became a competent wader and diver, started standing upright to move through shallow water, used free hands to collect food, and, as the theory loves to emphasize, feasted on omega-3 rich seafood that supposedly helped the brain expand and pushed us toward intelligence. In that version of history, the aquatic chapter is the key turning point, the moment humans truly diverge from other primates. It's a seductive idea. The only issue is that it's mostly seduction. We've never found the fossil remains of this Neopithecus, and a lot of the evidence reads like clever storytelling more than hard proof. Hairlessness could be explained without water, finger webbing can be dismissed as ancient leftover anatomy, omega-3 doesn't require you to live like a seal, so unsurprisingly, the modern form of the hypothesis has toned itself down. The newer take doesn't try to overthrow the savanna model and doesn't insist on humans being semi-aquatic full-time. It basically says there was a long period when our ancestors clustered around lakes, rivers, and shorelines, which is not exactly controversial. Everyone already agrees early humans ate whatever was edible, and if it wasn't immediately edible, they tried to solve the problem with a stick first. That's also why you won't see the aquatic theory treated as serious in mainstream academic texts. But it's still worth knowing, if only because the next idea in this episode hits a much bigger target: the comforting belief that evolution moves slowly, neatly, and predictably, with a clear chain of tiny transitions you can line up like dominoes. Because where are those dominoes? We don't get a clean parade of in-between forms, we get sharp jumps. Here's a Neanderthal, here's a Denisovan, and suddenly here's Homo sapiens. Zoom out and you see the same pattern across life in general. Darwin himself admitted this was a headache, and people typically answer it in two ways: the fossil record is incomplete, or maybe evolution sometimes jumps. That second option is saltationism, associated with Hugo de Vries in 1901. And unlike the aquatic hypothesis, it comes with an unsettling amount of real-world support. Take memory, for example. Pure chemistry says it shouldn't work the way it does. Proteins are fragile, they shouldn't stay stable in the brain for years. And yet, you still remember that one humiliating school moment like it happened yesterday. Drop yours in the comments. What matters here is the mechanism. Once the memory-related proteins are triggered, the brain doesn't just store a file, it physically remodels itself. Neurons get reshaped, connections get reinforced, and that's how a short-term signal hardens into long-term memory.
This memory puzzle drove researchers crazy for years, until 1995, when they pinned down a protein called ARC. Pretty quickly, they showed a brutal little detail. ARC behaves like it's on a countdown timer. It's made to break down, and before it does, it forces the brain to remodel connections, basically locking in memories. And when ARC doesn't work properly, people often struggle with long-term memory. That explains the how. The why arrived later, in 2018, and it's the part that feels like horror sci-fi. At Cambridge's Laboratory of Molecular Biology, scientists imaged ARC and noticed its structure isn't just similar to viruses, it's uncomfortably close. Then came the mouse experiments. ARC was introduced and it acted like a viral delivery system, pushing genetic instructions into RNA the way a virus would. So the story looks like this. Roughly 350 to 400 million years ago, a four-limbed ancestor shared by a huge chunk of modern animals got infected by something in the family tree of today's retroviruses. And by a freak chain of luck, it didn't die. Instead, evolution did what it loves doing. It stole the trick. The brain repurposed the invader's machinery for changing neural wiring and turned it into a feature, long-term memory. Basically, a distant cousin of HIV and nasty respiratory infections once stopped being a villain and got hired as a brain engineer. And the crazy part is speed, not over slow millennia, more like a generation or two, which drops us right into saltationism, the idea that evolution doesn't always creep forward in tiny steps, but sometimes jumps hard in just a few generations. If that's true, then the reason we walk upright, lost our body hair, and yes, somehow ended up obsessed with anime might not be hidden in a perfectly gradual ladder of changes. It could trace back to one lucky accident in one organism, and that single change yanked the lineage in a new direction almost instantly. For a long time, that sounded like a joke theory. After ARC, it stops feeling like a joke. Memory is one of the most important upgrades in humans and other complex animals. Superheroes are cute, but imagine the real nightmare. You can only keep the last 2 minutes in your head. In that world, storing experiences for years would be the ultimate superpower, way above flying or shooting lasers. And now the punchline turns serious. The ability may be the legacy of a random infection event that one individual survived, then passed on fast. From that perspective, the whole aquatic ape versus savanna debate and the idea of slow, patient training into bipedal life starts looking optional. Saltationism would tell you to toss the neat story arcs and think of evolution more like gambling. Most spins are nothing, but sometimes the wheel lands on jackpot and a species walks away with a brand new advantage. What's even funnier is that saltationism accidentally became fuel for other narratives too, like the mitochondrial Eve idea. We know all living humans share mitochondrial DNA through a single maternal line.
one woman in Africa, traditionally dated around 200,000 years ago, with some newer estimates closer to 124,000. If you're expecting a smooth, gradual, million-year conveyor belt, that feels strangely concentrated. It even echoes the arc vibe. What if there was a single, sharp mutation in one woman that made her descendants significantly more successful? The most common suspect people point at is, again, the brain. Some argue a random mutation could have produced a brain about 30% larger than her peers, which then spread through her group and from there expanded outward, outcompeting other lines. And once again, the tidy, slow, and steady model starts looking shaky. Saltationism, on the other hand, can swallow this whole. Sudden leaps, fast spread, and also a clean explanation for why evolution didn't simply stack every beneficial mutation and erase every useless trait over time.
And yet, for all its brilliance, evolution still refuses to delete one of humanity's most annoying updates, wisdom teeth. We'd love that patch. The standard Darwinian story usually gives you a vague shrug here. Saltationism is harsher and more honest. Evolution isn't your customer support. If you want a world without wisdom teeth, you'll have to wait until a lucky mutation produces someone who simply doesn't grow them. And then that person has to reproduce and spread the gene. If they don't find a partner, congrats, the upgrade dies with them. None of that is an argument for dumping Darwin into a dumpster. Natural selection is still the best supported framework we have, but Darwin himself openly pointed out gaps, and sometimes even crazy hypotheses, like the aquatic ape idea, are useful, if only because they force us to test assumptions and explain details we normally ignore. Because the truth is, evolution is stuffed with weird, explosive facts. Take fungi. Fungi aren't basically plants. In the family tree, they sit closer to animals than to plants. We're in the same major group, Opisthokonta. At one point in early development, a human starts as a single cell with a tail-like flagellum at the back, conceptually the same kind of architecture you see in that lineage. Plus, fungi store energy as glycogen, just like animals do, not as starch like plants. And the last shared ancestor between us and fungi isn't some ancient fog of eternity, it's roughly 1 billion years ago. Imagine a single-celled ocean drifter, a little vacuum cleaner blob with a rear flagellum, resembling the kinds of cells you see in sponges. Which brings us to another brain melter, sponges. Sponges are primitive, organless, brainless, and somehow they're closer relatives to humans than insects are. Which is hilarious because insects actually have a nervous system and a brain, while sponges are basically just vibes. But evolution doesn't care about vibes, it cares about ancestry. Sponges are simply animals that took a different route. You could even call it the older was fine route. The same basic cellular blueprint, just scaled up. More cells, more cooperation, better adaptation without needing flashy new organs. And that raises another huge mystery, convergent evolution. How do totally separate branches end up building similar systems independently? Nervous systems, complex behaviors, and especially vision. Eyes are the classic example. Estimates suggest vision emerged dozens of times, something like 40 to 65 separate origins, each on its own evolutionary path, without borrowing the design from the others.
In my view, that's actually a jab in saltationism's direction, because nature keeps stubbornly trying to build the same features in all kinds of very different organisms. And from there, it's not far to jokes about living in the Matrix. So, I think we'll wrap it up. Support my channel in the comments. Hope you found it interesting. New video coming soon.